Hey Swamp Folk, good to see you made it back for another episode. Today's video is a little longer than the usual ones, I'm sure you're noticing, and that's because it's a compilation. These are some of the strangest and creepiest stories I've read over the month of April. You may have heard some of these before, and some others may be new to you. As always, if you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. Thank you guys so much for supporting these videos, and I hope you enjoy this long, creepy, and entertaining horror stories video. I'm telling the story on behalf of my friend who experienced this traumatic incident. It will be told from his perspective. Also, I apologize in advance since English is not my first language. First, to provide some background, I'm a 21-year-old guy, and I live in what I like to call medical housing. Basically, in this little village I live in, you either must be retired or have health problems like I do, but at the same time, you must be able to be somewhat self-sufficient. Each resident has their own cottage. The layout of the cottage can either be 1 bedroom or 2 bedrooms. Mine was a 1 bedroom. As soon as you walk into the cottage, you walk into the living room, and then the dining room is on the right, and in the dining room there is a way to the back porch. Then there is a kitchen, a small hallway in the living room that leads to the bathroom and the bedroom. There is a closet in the living room by the front door, another closet in the bedroom. Then there is a huge walk-in closet in the bedroom as well. This is just the layout of my specific cottage. Each cottage is different. Now, on to the story. This incident took place 2 weeks ago. While I was at social hour with a few of my fellow residents at the village, a couple of them were mentioning how they were getting knocks on the door at night, and on the windows. One resident claimed that someone even tried to twist the doorknob on her front door, but luckily it was nighttime when this took place, and it was locked. We all just thought it was just a couple of kids being little delinquents, since we were not too far from another neighborhood. We just assumed that the person was just messing around. Our village did not have a whole lot of security because at the time we did not feel very many disturbances. We didn't really think that we needed it being so tucked away in a safe area. Fast forward a few days. I had to go to physical therapy, and I must have forgotten to lock my front door or my back porch door, which again, due to how safe the area usually is, I did not worry too much about. Even during this pandemic, the village is very vibrant. You often see a bunch of residents walking around and talking to one another, since we are such a tight-knit community. So usually if someone tried to sneak in that should not be there, someone would catch on. When I got home from physical therapy, I was extremely tired, and I took a long nap. I woke up to my neighbor from across the street coming in to help me get set up on all my machines, such as my feeding machine and my breathing equipment for the night. Her name is Vicky. She is an overly sweet, compassionate, and motherly person. Before her and her husband retired, she used to be a nurse and her husband Frank used to be a police officer. I got to know them well, since Vicky helped me become Catholic 2 years prior. During the day, we have staff that come help us with our basic needs if we need it, such as getting to and from our bathroom and bed safely. They are not trained with medical training that I need, but a lot of the residents that I know that live here used to be nurses before they retired. We made it a little routine in our little village that for some of the residents like me who are not retired but younger with health problems, the more able-bodied retired residents, if they used to be nurses, would go help the residents that have health problems with their medical care, since they have years of medical experience under their belt. I was waking up from my nap when Vicky said, "Hey sweetheart, I'm here to do the care for you." Before she could finish her sentence, she paused while she was grabbing the IV bag for the night. Then, out of nowhere, she went over to my furnace and turned on my heat, but she didn't really twist the dial and she said, "That's strange, your heat's not working. It's supposed to be a cold night tonight, and we cannot have you sleeping without any heat due to your health. Why don't you come stay at my cottage for the night until maintenance comes and fix your heat in the morning?" I was very groggy from being tired and doing lots of work at physical therapy that I did not think twice about what she said until I saw the look on her face. She used to be in a theater group when she was in college, and since I grew up in theater groups as well, I could tell when someone was acting, and even though she was a good actor, I could tell something was going on. She was pretending that my heat was not working. I was nervous and wondering what was going on, but I just went along with it. All my medical supplies that I would need for the night were right next to my travel suitcase that would fit all my supplies, and my feeding pump was on my IV pole, my oxygen tank was on wheels, and my BiPAP could easily be packed into my travel suitcase. She got everything packed up quickly, and she helped me get up and walk to my front door, and I could tell she was going a little fast, but I was too tired to say anything. While she was walking me out of the house, I heard something come from my walk-in closet, and I assumed it was just the cat using his litter box or something. Due to my health problems and my breathing, it's really not good if I get scared. I could stop breathing altogether. The reason why I say this is because when she got me in the house, and as Frank was getting the extra bed set up for me, she explained to me that when she was grabbing an IV bag from where I keep them, since it was right next to the walk-in closet, she caught a glimpse of someone crouching in my closet, and she had to pretend that my heater was not working. I felt like I was going to throw up, because for all I know, that person could have been in there the entire time I was at physical therapy, or they could have made their way in there while I was taking a nap. The sense of serenity I had at that village was temporarily gone. Vicky could tell I was disturbed by this, so she gave me a hug and said, "Don't be scared. Frank and I will be here with you all night." I wish I could say this was the end of the story, but it is not. After Vicky got me ready for the night, and while I was sleeping, I woke up to hearing tapping on the spare bedroom window, and lo and behold, I saw the person that Vicky was talking about who was hiding in my closet. It was a man. I do not know how tall he was, but from my guess, he was probably 6 feet tall, maybe a little under. He literally tapped on the window and said, "I see you awake in there, and I'm coming in one way or another." I called for Vicky, and she woke up right away and said a concerned, "Frank, get your gun now." Even though he's retired, Frank is still an intimidating guy, even without the gun, and both him and Vicky were rushing in the room. Since I could not get up on my own due to me being hooked up to my machines, I was beyond scared because I really could not defend myself. As soon as they both came in, Frank pointed his gun at the lunatic who was still at the window. Frank said, "Get off my property before I blow your freaking brains out, you nutcase." As Frank was threatening the crazy person at the other side of the window, Vicky was helping me get up, and both her and I went and hid in the walk-in closet in the master bedroom. She locked the door to the master bedroom. Because I was starting to get really scared, it was starting to affect my breathing, and even though I was still hooked up to my oxygen, due to how scared I was, there was a risk that I could stop breathing out of nowhere due to me being really scared. When I was having trouble breathing, Vicky said, "Honey, I know you're scared, but I need you to do some nice and easy breathing." A few minutes later, there was a knocking at the master bedroom door. Vicky asked who it was, and it was Frank. As soon as she went and opened the door, Frank came rushing in and told her to call the police because the guy was not just tapping on the window now, he was literally banging. Vicky called the police, and luckily, since they do drive-bys at the village quite frequently, a cop car was not far away. When they came, they found cracks in her window in the spare bedroom, but unfortunately, they did not find the guy. The police asked if I could give them a statement on what went on, but Vicky told them that would not be possible because of my breathing. I was practically traumatized. I was so scared. So Frank gave my statement on behalf of me. Due to the cracks on the window and me being beyond shaken up, there was no way I was sleeping in that spare bedroom, and now my breathing had to be watched carefully throughout the night. Frank slept in the spare bedroom that night while Vicky and I slept in the master. I was a bit more comforted there. The police got in contact with the staff at the office the next day regarding what happened, and ever since this incident, the staff has hired overnight security guards and day security. They are working on raising enough money to set up a gate to block people from coming in that should not be there. A few days after this, Frank installed security cameras and alarms in my cottage, and in his as well. Now, I always make sure I lock my door when I'm going out, when I'm taking a nap, and at night. This is currently happening, and I'm not sure what to do about it. There is this girl at my job, Amy. She seemed like a sweet girl and fun to talk to. Also extremely cute. We became work friends. I would look forward to chatting with her at work. Nothing major. We exchanged numbers and texted occasionally. Funny memes, pet photos, etc. Then it escalated a little bit. Amy started flirting with me, so I flirted back. We would send each other selfies on Snapchat, and she started sending me slightly risque photos. It was nothing nude, but obvious flirting, you know? She said she thinks I'm cute, and she has a little crush on me. Well, I was having fun until I realized that Amy has a boyfriend, because he messaged me informing me he is her boyfriend, as well as a barrage of insults. He called me all kinds of stuff. He bets I'm ugly compared to him, that she is just using me for validation, that they played me, and they make fun of me together, and how ugly and stupid I am, etc. He told me to leave her alone, calling me a dirty N-word, like the racial slur, but I don't know why, because I am white. So I said, I'm sorry man, I didn't realize, I'll back off. Even though she initiated it, and I had no idea she had a boyfriend, but whatever. I blocked her and everything and avoided her at work. Despite this, he started contacting me from fake numbers constantly, just insulting me. Psychotic rants that would switch from begging, please man, don't do it, please don't sleep with her, to screw you man, I hope you die in a fire. Like out of nowhere. I told him again that I do not want anything to do with her anymore and that I blocked her and that he needs to stop bugging me. You would think that would be over, but no. Amy contacted me yet again. She made a second Instagram account, found me, and started messaging me, wanting to have sex. I was like, no, I'm staying far away from you. Bye. And I blocked her. Somehow her boyfriend found out because he called me from a blocked number and screamed slurs into the phone. The slurs made zero sense, as he used terms for Jewish people, Mexican people, and black people. Like I said, I'm white, so I don't really understand a lot of these slurs, but I know they're bad and I don't want to repeat them at all. They're honestly disgusting. He sounded like a 13-year-old trying to think of every slur and swear word to use. There sounded like there was a struggle in the background and he hung up. He called back repeatedly screaming into the phone, calling me ugly and more slurs. I heard smashing glass and other noises like there was a physical fight going on. I should have called the cops, but I did not because it's not my business. Again, I thought that would be the end of it. Amy started ignoring me altogether, then she started calling me gay and all kinds of other stuff, and said that she was woke as hell compared to me and that I'm a loser. I keep getting requests on Instagram from obviously fake accounts. He has texted me, even more fake numbers at odd hours. Texting calls are one thing, but I've gotten a little scared because for the past 5 or so nights, I keep seeing the same old red car parking in the back of my work parking lot, facing the window to the restaurant, just sitting there, for a couple of hours, every single day. I think it's the guy stalking me at work. I'm getting paranoid about my safety. I can hold my own, but some people are just unstable, and you never know who you are dealing with. He has not made any outright threats though, so I feel like I cannot do anything as far as reporting him. I am considering telling my manager at work, but I don't think they will care. Perhaps they might even blame me. I am literally considering quitting my job. It is just a restaurant gig, because of these actions. It is super creepy. I do not know why I triggered this guy so much. It is so stupid because it's obviously not my fault. This is Amy and her boyfriend's fault. You would think that they are in high school, but we're all in our mid to late 20s. This scary is less scary and more unnerving. I work in a Waffle House as a waitress right next to a big city. We had this regular customer, a bigger man, who was missing an eye due to health issues and beyond his golden years. He came in around 2 or 3 times a week after his dialysis treatments and would always tell stories of a woman he knew. He always called her Tiffany. I thought the stories were tales of an old, bored man and nothing more, but the moment she walked in, I knew it was all true. He would tell me how he and this woman had been friends at first, but then she turned to meth, completely losing herself and her mental health. He was going to leave the friendship, but her daughter had grown attached to him, and he had grown attached to her. This woman, through the next 4 years, would falsely accuse him of crimes and call the police, and every time the cops would arrest her instead. She would disappear and return at random times. One time, the regular, who we will call Quinn, bought her 4-year-old a simple phone in case she ever needed to contact him, but Tiffany ended up taking the phone and using it. He would also tell me the numerous times that Tiffany would try and get her kids back since they were taken out of her custody by the state. Every time Tiffany would do the first step and then never follow through, she always returned to drugs. Tiffany not only had a daughter, but she also had a son who was a bit older. He was about 9 years old. He lived with her parents. Like I said, at first I thought this was just an old man who just wanted to tell stories in his old years, but on that Wednesday night, everything he said was proven true. Quinn got numerous calls throughout his time sitting in his seat, and after a while, I looked at the caller ID. It said Lulu Bear, Tiffany's daughter. I wondered why he ignored it, but he told me he knew it was Tiffany. I understood and went back to listening to his tales. Then he finally answered the phone after 18 calls and 25 texts. I did not even listen as new customers had come in and I went to serve them. When I returned, he set down the phone and told me I was going to meet Tiffany. I was intrigued. I knew she was a real person, and I really wanted to meet her as every time he came, I would hear more and more about her. She was taking the bus from the neighboring state over, but she was near the border, so it only took about 35 minutes. When she finally arrived and I saw her state, that is when it hit me that every word he had said had been true. She was around 5'5", 155 pounds. She had long, stringy black hair that was in a big messy bun, covered by a dirty blue hat. She wore stained light brown jeans and a tight-fitting blue jacket. She was pale, and her eyes were sunken in. She had a large bag and a baby stroller full of stuff sitting next to Quinn's truck. For context, I am 17 years old and female, but I am always told that I look to be between ages of 20 and 25. At first, she said hi and told me her name was something other than what Quinn was already telling me, and when he called her out, she argued with him. I internally laughed and I was glad to mask my smile. Then she turned to me. This is how the brief exchange went. "Can I get a coffee?" "Yeah, sure. Unless it's weird. I don't want it to be weird." "Oh, no, it's okay. I don't want it if you're going to spit in it." I was caught off guard. She continued to insist I was going to spit in it, but I assured her I was not going to do so. I made sure to pour the coffee in front of her and put the lid on it in front of her. She seemed at ease now that she knew I had not sabotaged her coffee. She then began to ask me questions about how I felt about Quinn, and going on long rants about his medical problems. I knew about some, but she told me they were going to amputate his leg. He tried to correct her, saying that he was getting it checked out, which I later found out that his ankle was broken. Once she got settled with her coffee, Quinn asked where the bus dropped her off, and she refused to tell him. He asked why, and she said she did not want to implicate the bus driver in anything. I was confused. Implicate him in what? Quinn continued to ask, but she gave the same response every time, adding in later that he dropped her off like a normal person. This was one of those buses that had a variety of stops around the same area. Once we got off the topic of the bus, she continued to ask me questions, which some I answered honestly and others not. She asked if I knew someone who could weld. I said yes, my long-term boyfriend. She wanted him to weld a peg leg for Quinn because of the supposed amputation. I humored her and said I would ask. She then asked me if I liked kids, and I said yes. What she asked me next completely threw me for a loop. "Take my kid." What? You mean like babysit? I had babysat before, and everyone told me that I had that appearance, so it was not an uncommon question. "No, become his foster mom." I stared at her, mind-boggled. I informed her I was only 17 and would not turn 18 until November of this year. She continued to ask and tell me how sweet he was. I let her know when I turned 18, I would consider it. This was a lie, but I wanted to appease her. It seemed to work, but the weirdness did not stop there. She asked me to promise her to go into early childhood development when I went to college, and once again, just to soothe her methed-out mind, I said I would do it as a minor in college. She asked what I wanted my major to be, and I informed her I wanted to go to culinary school and become a baker and pastry chef. We talked a little bit about desserts, and then she went outside. I was hoping that it was over. Not more than 5 minutes later, she returned. We got back into the topic of kids. She asked me if I had any, and I said no. She asked if I wanted any, and I said yes in the future. She immediately told me I should get pregnant right now because it would make my mom happy. I know that no one reading this knows my family, but if I got pregnant while I was still in high school, I would not be able to see my graduation. I told her that would not be happening for 2 reasons. One is that I was too young. Not shaming any young moms out there, but I just did not believe in doing that deed until I was married. I also believed that everyone had their own choice, so I did not care what anyone else did with their life, but I personally wanted to wait. She continued to insist I should get pregnant, and once again, I told her I wanted to wait. She then surprised me with her questions, once again. "Oh, is your boyfriend bad in bed? Is he paraplegic?" I could not answer the first question, and the second question was not true. I told her no, and she accused me of being impure because she thought I used birth control. I do not and never have, but it was also none of her business. I told her I was not, and she then called me pure, the perfect girl for fertilization. This creeped me out. As the shift was ending and the other workers came in, I finished up my end of shift duties and Quinn and Tiffany left. I left about 20 minutes after they did, but when I walked outside, his truck was still there. Side note, working at a Waffle House, I learned to always have my keys ready to get into my car. Anyways, I heard arguing and saw Quinn sitting in his truck while Tiffany yelled at him as she held onto her baby stroller full of stuff. I did not stare but merely glanced. When I did, she looked at me. I honestly thought she was going to come to me and ask for a ride, so I ran faster to my car and locked the doors as soon as I closed them. I drove home and told my mom, who just laughed and told me I was right about how she would react if I did get pregnant. In the end, it was something to laugh at, but it was still creepy, and it's something that I never want to experience ever again. So, be wary out there when you're working. Don't be too trusting, and definitely watch out for them meffed out people. This story will be told from the point of view of my old roommate. This event happened shortly after we moved out and went our separate ways, and still gives me chills to this day. I began moving into my new one-bedroom apartment with my boyfriend the day after the old lease ended. My apartment was small in size and on the bottom floor. There was a window in the bedroom that faces the outside walkway and the front door to our apartment. I spent the whole day carrying boxes from my boyfriend's truck to the apartment. I noticed a dirty-looking man in a rusty, beat-up red Toyota staring at us while we moved each box. He looked to be about 40 years old or so, had round glasses with a very thin frame. His hair was stringy and thinning at the top, and looked as if he had once been white, but yellow due to lack of cleanliness. I wouldn't have given his gaze much thought, except he had been sitting in his car for nearly 2 hours now. He didn't seem to be waiting for anyone, just was staring at us, moving his head to keep his gaze as we moved from the truck to our building. I told my boyfriend and he just shrugged it off, telling me that maybe he was just a neighbor trying to see who moved in. We just ignored the man and finished unloading boxes before settling in for the night. Fast forward to the next night. My boyfriend and I had unpacked most of the kitchen, so we were having a late dinner and ended up drinking some wine. It was around 12:30 a.m. and we were just talking and hanging out when we heard a slight tap on the window. It was strange. It wasn't as if someone were knocking on it, but more like if someone had accidentally hit it with an object of some sort. I peeked through the blinds to find nothing but darkness outside. Without giving it a second thought, my boyfriend and I finished up our dinner and wine, turned out the lights, and went to bed. We awoke around 2 a.m. to a soft knock on the door. My boyfriend, very tired and very irritated, got up from the bed to go check the peephole to see who could possibly be outside trying to reach us at such a late hour. He looked through the peephole to find a man standing outside the door, staring directly into the peephole. He sneakily made his way back to our room, carefully trying to not make any sound, so whoever it was outside could not hear the movement within the apartment. He went up to me and shook my leg a bit, whispering that there was some creepy old man outside the door, just staring at it. I awoke immediately and slowly went to the window to see who it was. The blinds are raised about only an inch or so I tried to identify the man using the small sliver of window that was exposed. I saw a hand tapping on the window, tapping as if he was patiently waiting for someone to open the door for him. I froze in fear and waited. We heard the man turn around and leave. My boyfriend checked the front door to confirm that he wasn't outside our door anymore, as I was terrified to even peek out the window. We were so bugged out that we didn't even end up sleeping much for the rest of the night. The next day, we were really anxious and worried about the situation, so we spoke with our front office and tried to explain what happened. The front office basically tried to play it off as someone who was lost, and maybe they just found the wrong apartment or something. It wasn't that big of a deal, and we just needed to not worry about it. They said if it happened again to try to identify the person or talk to them to see what they wanted. Great advice, right? Later that night, we left the front porch light on to feel a bit more safe. We locked all the doors and windows and cuddled in bed with the lights off while watching some TV show on low volume. Eventually, we drifted off to sleep. I awoke around 2:20 a.m. to my boyfriend tapping me and whispering, "He's back," wide-eyed with fear. I let out a small gasp. My boyfriend handed me a small pistol and said, "Don't shoot unless you need to," and left the room. I was completely terrified, confused, and worried at this point. I decided to try to see who this creep was. I once again looked through the small sliver of window that was showing, but could only see their bottom half. I made my way to the front door where my boyfriend was. his face glued to the peephole. I asked if I could take a look, and instantly I could make out who it was. I saw the yellowed, thinning hair and the glasses. It was the same man who was watching us move in a few days ago. I took a step back and began to silently freak out. I was completely terrified at this point. We heard the man silently knock again on the door. He leaned in real close to the peephole, startling my boyfriend and causing him to let out a small gasp. The man leaned back, turned around, and immediately walked upstairs. We waited. We never saw him come back down. We never heard movement in the upstairs apartment either. Frightened, we went back to bed and didn't sleep until the sun came. As soon as the office opened, we went in to report the incident, and one of the leasing managers looked distressed. She went on to tell them that this was the 5th report on similar incidents made by multiple tenants throughout the apartment complex. She told us that they were looking into it to find out who this person was. For about a week we heard nothing, but no one came to the door during the dark hours of the night. We began to get back into our normal routine and paid no mind to the weirdness that we had experienced. About 3 weeks after the last incident, we received a call from the front office. Apparently there was a disturbed tenant that lived in the complex that had always had really random and weird complaints about him. He was an older man, apparently had some issues in his past. They were calling to let us know that he was the one who had been randomly knocking on doors and sneaking around multiple buildings in the complex. They said he had been evicted due to his behavior and that we wouldn't have to deal with it again. They apologized, then hung up, and that was that. We never heard weird noises or saw his car in the parking lot after that. We continued to live out the rest of our lease and eventually moved out to a nicer apartment complex across town. It's always stuck with me though. I always get skittish during the nights and would check the windows multiple times before bed. I think the strangest thing to me was that the building we lived in wasn't even really close to the one that he apparently resided in. He had watched us move in and decided that's who he wanted to creep on in the middle of the night. If there's one thing that I learned, it's to listen to that gut feeling inside of you. Always be aware of your surroundings, and be careful who is paying attention to you. Hey Swamp, I've been listening to your channel for quite a few years now. I love all the cryptid stories. I honestly believe that there are things out there that we have not been told about, that most of the stories you get to narrate are 100% true. I chose to send this to you because you are my favorite narrator. I've been holding off on sharing this story for a long time, but I think I'm ready now. I saw something I should not have seen, and it has made me paranoid for some years. I figured it would be a good middle-of-nowhere story. Unfortunately, I will not be very descriptive on locations, names, or ages. However, I will say that this happened in Oregon, roughly 6 years ago. A friend of mine inherited a piece of property owned by his parents who had passed away. He was not on particularly good terms with them, but still, they left him the land in their will. Within a week after he inherited the property, he got multiple offers from the government wanting to buy it. They had already owned all the land surrounding it. He refused each offer, and from what he told me, they even got rough with him a few times. But he was determined to make something out of it. This piece of land was just that, land. There was an old run-down homestead on it that was probably last occupied in the early 1900s. It was truly out in the middle of nowhere. You had to follow this old pothole-filled gravel road for what felt like hours just to get there. I've done the research on Google Maps, and the closest sign of any civilization was well over 60 miles away in either direction. The only other sign of human life out there was what looked like an old government communication building, not too far from where his property started. This building will play a huge part in the story. I had been living with a group of friends from high school in a house that we all shared the rent for. Roommates can be fun, but I got tired of it after a while. Constant noise, food being stolen from the fridge, people not holding up their part of the rent, all that good stuff. So, when I got a call from my friend asking me to come help him out on his new property, I jumped at the idea. Within the next few days, I had my bags packed, said my goodbyes, and hit the road. It was a long drive across the state, but it was nice. The east side of Oregon is a beautiful and vast place. I stopped in the last town on the way to grab some supplies. my friend asked me to pick up. After that, it was about another hour down straight stretches with the occasional farmhouse off to the side. Once I hit the gravel road, I had to slow my way down and navigate around all the potholes. It was a creepy vibe, but I just shook it off as it was beautiful country. Juniper trees and ponderosa pines dotted along the road. You could see plateaus in the distance. It felt like the Old West. There were no power lines, but instead there were old telegraph lines from the last century still standing. As I was going down the road, I saw this structure coming up on the side and stopped to see what it was. It was two circular walls made from old logs. They were horse corrals, clearly not in use anymore, another relic from the last century. I walked around to the entrance and was shocked to see multiple deer carcasses inside of them. It freaked me out at first, but I figured that a cougar or something must be living in them, so I hopped back in the truck and continued down the road. I still could not shake the bad vibes though, but still, I just did my best to ignore it. If I were going to be out there in the middle of nowhere, then I could not let myself be freaked out by every little thing. My friend was going to meet me on the road near his property, so he could lead me the rest of the way. There were lots of old roads leading off the main one, so it would be easy to go down the wrong one. I was not too far from the old corrals when I could see him waiting by his truck. I pulled up and he had the happiest look on his face, like I was the first person he had seen in months. Mostly because I was the first person he had seen in months. We sat on the road for a bit and had a few laughs as we were catching up before we headed down to the property. It was still about another 20-minute drive down this side road. It was getting dark by then. We passed the old government communications building, and I was very confused as to what it was and why it was there, all the way out here. It was small. It was 2 stories tall, but maybe about the size of a convenience store as far as length and width goes. It also had at least 9-foot tall fences surrounding it, with barbed wire across the top. It looked very ominous in the low lighting, and gave me that bad feeling again. Once we got on the property, I was surprised and relieved he had already built a nice little cabin. There was no electricity because the power line stopped before you hit the gravel, but there was plenty of lighting from the fireplace and some solar flashlights hanging from the rafters. It was cozy. I immediately asked him about the government building before I had my shoes off. He said that he has never really gone near it and had no idea what the purpose was. So, fast forward a few months. We had this property up and running. We dug a well and powered it with solar panels, so we could have fresh running water. We built a barn and got some goats. We had a dairy cow, chickens, and some alpacas. We even had a tropical greenhouse with a banana tree, lime trees, and pineapples. To keep it the right climate, we put a wood stove inside to keep it warm like the tropics. It was turning into a nice little farm. We purchased a portable sawmill and had a contract with one of the lumber stores in town. Once every 2 weeks, we would load up the trucks and make the journey into the town, sell the wood, and load up on propane and other supplies. I had been doing some exploring around the area on my days off. Things were weird out there, and they just kept getting weirder. My favorite thing to do was to head down the main road and pick up a random side road to go down and explore. Lots of times I would come up to a locked government gate with signs reading, "Government property, keep out," and "Area is under video surveillance," which was strange because there were no power lines out there. Maybe they were underground. They were. We found this out later. So, I had the day off and I was doing my thing exploring the area. I decided to head to the old horse corrals to check them out in the full daylight. As I started to see them coming up on the horizon, I noticed a black vehicle parked by them. As I got closer to it, I could see it was an all-black Mercedes with blacked-out windows and government plates. I put the truck in park and sat there dumbfounded. What is this doing out here? How did it get here? And when did the government get issued black Mercedes? Suddenly it started up and took off down the road in the opposite direction. I was a little freaked out, but it was gone, so I decided to continue with my exploring. I pulled up to the corrals and walked around.
I took a few pictures of them to send back to my friends and family. There were also more deer carcasses inside of them. Again, I just assumed some cougar took a liking to the old corrals and takes its prey there. Curiosity got the best of me, and I started looking around at where the Mercedes was parked. Near its tracks was a hole in the ground. It just looked like your typical animal burrow. As I walked around it, some dirt fell in from my footsteps. The dirt shot back out as if there was a wind blowing out of this hole. I did a double take and kneeled next to it and put my hand over it. Sure enough, I could feel cool air coming out of the hole. To double check, I grabbed a handful of dirt and dumped it in there, and again, it blew right back out. What I did next is stupid, and nobody should ever do this, but I reached my arm inside cautiously. I could not feel anything, no walls and no bottom, no snakes either. So I laid on my stomach and reached as far as I could, all the way up to my shoulder, and I still could not feel a thing. Just an empty space with an air current flowing through. I was baffled by this and went back to the truck to get my friend and show him. I got back to the property and told him he needs to come check this hole in the ground. He was not interested until I also told him about the Mercedes. Both of us did not trust the government, so the fact that there was some weird phenomenon going out excited us. We reached the corrals and I had located the hole again. It had gotten much bigger though. In fact, it was almost double in size. I grabbed another handful of dirt to show it getting blown out. I dropped it in, and nothing happened. We noticed the dirt around the outside of the hole was slowly falling inside of it though. My friend was trying to be funny and said, "Maybe it's gone from a blow to a suck." So I tested it. I grabbed another handful of dirt and held it in the palm of my hand, and lowered it inside the hole. Sure enough, it was getting sucked over the sides of my palm. I was once again baffled. We checked the surrounding area for another hole that maybe the wind was blowing through to create these effects, but we could not find anything. We finally deemed it as maybe an old mine shaft or something. The discovery of the hole had got my imagination flowing. Something about it did not settle well with me. I had to know what it was, and for some reason, I thought I would find the answer inside of that old communications building. I decided that I was going to break into it on my next day off. Nobody comes out there. It is obviously not in use anymore. What is the harm of checking it out? So my next day off had arrived, and I was excited to check the building out. Nervous, but excited. I parked my truck a little down the road from it just in case they had it under surveillance. I had gloves on and made sure to cover my face. The gate was locked, of course, but there was just barely enough room for me to squeeze through between it underneath the lock and chain. I tried to get in through the ground level door, but it did not even have a doorknob on the outside of it, so I gave up on that strategy quickly. There was a metal staircase around the side of the building leading up to the second floor door. This one had a doorknob. I tried picking it, but it was a lot harder than the YouTube videos made it out to be. So instead, I just used brute force and twisted the knob as hard as I could, and to my surprise, it snapped, and just like that, the mysterious building was unlocked and ripe for exploring. I opened the door and was almost thrown off the balcony by a swarm of flies. There were thousands of them that had all been trapped in that building and immediately flew out all at once. When they saw that first glimpse of daylight, it was disgusting. I ran down the stairs and waited for them all to fly out. Once it was clear, I walked back up cautiously and did a quick check in the inside. It was in bad shape, paint peeling off the walls, debris and trash all over the place, and the smell of an old book. I was still excited about it, and decided to close it back up and come back with my friend so we could check it out together. So I head back to the property to get my friend. I had the stupidest grin on my face when I told him I got into the building. He instantly lit up and was just as excited as I was. He was a little more paranoid about it though, and insisted that we both go back there at night. That was okay with me. So for the rest of the day, we sat around planning on how we were going to go about it, and what we were going to do in case things went wrong. We had a plan for every situation. We still were not prepared for what was in there though. A few hours go by, and night has finally fallen. It was time. We grabbed some flashlights and put on gloves, covered our faces, and headed out the door. We stayed on foot, mainly because the headlights from a vehicle would be too easy to spot. There was not anybody around for miles, but we did not want to take any chances. We walked up to the gate, squeezed through the same spot I went through earlier, and then we headed up the metal staircase to the door I popped open. I opened it slowly in case there were more flies. A few flew out, but not nearly as many as earlier in the day. And just like that, we were in, flashlights on, and in exploring mode. The state of disrepair this place was in was even more freaky at night. There were all sorts of trash on the ground and dead mice and thousands of dead flies. Apparently this was just the front half of the building though. There was another locked door that led to the back half of the building. Here's where things really take a turn for the worse. We could see light coming from underneath this door. Remember, there are no power lines. This confirmed that power was being run out here underground. I wanted to turn back after that, but my friend was in full-on conspiracy mode and was going to get into the back half of this place no matter what. What if there were people in there? There could not be. We were the only people out here for 60 miles in each direction. There were no vehicles out front. Why is there a light on in this random government building out in the middle of nowhere? This was stupid, but we knocked on it. We were already in the place, so why not? Nobody answered. Thank God. This door was just like the one on the ground level outside, with no handle. Luckily, my friend was better than me at working his way around locks, and he managed to pop it open. Once the door opened, we knew we were not supposed to be there. My stomach sank and I instantly felt sick. This was bad. The back half of this building was still in use. It was well kept. There were office chairs, desks, computers, coffee mugs, and a communications board with plugs to connect calls to other lines. We were in way over our heads. We both knew this, and for some reason we kept exploring. The back half of this building was divided into two sections with a wall and another locked door separating them. The first section contained all the office and communications equipment. My friend worked his magic on the door leading to the second section. This section was unexpected. Lab coats, safety goggles, chemistry equipment, weird machines, and bins with dangerous chemical labels on them. Most of these chemicals we did not even recognize. I have Googled some of them and cannot find any results. But the worst part, the reason we are all here, in this second section, in the middle of the room, was a hatch. The type of hatch that you lift to find a ladder underneath. It was big, but it was armored, like something you would find on a freighter ship. At this point, we both wanted to leave and get out of there. This place had a basement. What in the actual hell? For some reason, we told ourselves we have come this far, we must see what is down there. So we inspected the hatch. It was not locked. I really wish it had been. It had one of those circular handles that you rotate to open. It took us both to get it to move. It creaked as we opened it, and below us, we could see a ladder leading down into a pitch-black room. We both looked at each other and paused, as if to say, are we really doing this right now? Yep, we are. I went down first to make sure everything was okay, flashlight in hand. It was cold and dark. The room seemed small. It did not take up as much space as the building above it. I gave my friend the all clear and told him to climb down. While he was climbing down, I was shining my light at the ceiling to see if there were any lights. There were. I told my friend to help me find a light switch, so we both started scanning the walls with our flashlights. As I was scanning, my light shined on what looked like a prison cell. A cage with bars. At that same time, my friend had found the light switch and flipped it on. And to my horror, there was something in the cage. I got my friend's attention and pointed at it, while yelling obscenities. I could not tell whatever it was, dead or alive. It was I don't know. It was just lying there inside the cage. I can only describe it as being a thing. Its hair was long and matted, and I could just barely make out an elongated nose of where its head was. We started panicking and scanning the rest of the room. Behind us was a garage door. We both turned to look at the door with all sorts of questions and fears running through our minds. Above the door was a camera. Crap. At this point, we were done. I told him, "That's it, dude, we're leaving now. I don't know what the hell is going on here, but we need to leave." Suddenly, we started to hear something. The subtle sound of an engine coming from the other side of the garage door getting louder. This was bad. My friend headed up the ladder first. I was waiting at the bottom of it. Suddenly, I hear something shuffling. My stomach sank. I turned to look at the cage. The thing in it was moving. I looked back up at my friend and told him to run. I turned back around and the creature was upon 2 legs looking at me through the bars. We made eye contact for just a split second, and then I started climbing the ladder as fast as I could. But I froze halfway up. I froze because it spoke to me.
"Help me."
I turned around with wide open eyes and I could not say anything. This could not be real. Its voice was exceptionally low and quiet. It had a sorrowful tone. I felt like I was going to vomit or black out. I turned back around and started climbing again, faster. It spoke again as I reached the top. This time, it told me its name. A first and last name. My friend was nowhere to be seen. He had already bolted out of there. I did the same thing. Back through the office room, through the purposely run down front, and out of the door. I ran faster than I ever have in my entire life, and did not stop until I got back to the cabin. My friend was already there, and I pounded on the door and he answered it with a gun in my face. Once he realized it was me, we both calmed down. I told him that the creature spoke to me, and that it was not safe out there. We gathered some things and hopped in our trucks and drove through the night into town, constantly checking our mirrors and taking every back road we could find. We ended up staying at a hotel for a couple of days. While we were there, we theorized about everything that we saw. There was a tunnel leading to the building behind that garage door. I am convinced that that is what the hole in the ground near that horse corral was. It was a cave-in, and the blacked-out Mercedes was there investigating it. Eventually, we finally got the courage to head back out to the property. I did not stay long, though. It just was not the same anymore. I ended up leaving only a few days after that. My friend was going to start putting everything up for sale so he could get out of there as well. I wished him the best of luck. I got my old room back at the house with my friends from high school. I remembered the creature's name, and I Googled it. The name came up on the missing person list from California. I stayed in my room. They all thought I was depressed, and maybe I was. I do not know what I was feeling. My whole outlook on the world had changed. I just kept staring at this person's picture for weeks. I still look at it every single day. I want to tell their family, but they would never believe me. Who would? Things got even worse. One night, about a month after I moved back into my roommates, my friend's mom called me with awful news. A wildfire had broken out on his property. It was during the night as he was sleeping. He got trapped in the cabin, and it was burnt down. The whole property and the surrounding area, including the government building, was burnt to a crisp. At least, that's what the official report says. I know it's BS, though. They know who was down there, which also means they know there's one other person that they need to track down, and that is me. I immediately packed a suitcase full of clothes and hit the road. I did not even say goodbye to anyone. I drove and kept driving until I could not anymore. I ended up halfway across the country until I started to calm down. From then on, I've been using a fake name, working low-key jobs that pay under the table, and saving every single penny I have earned. I sold my truck for next to nothing and bought a van that I have been living out of. I did not register it. How I have not been pulled over in the past 6 years is honestly a miracle. I have cut off all ties with my family and friends. They probably think I am dead, but that is good. I never stay in a place longer than 2 months. But finally, I would save up enough money to move out of the country. I have secured safe transport across the border and tomorrow I plan on restarting my life in South America. I am sending you this story using a fake email address and a disposable phone on a public Wi-Fi network in Texas. I am also going to send the parents of the once human creature a message explaining what has happened to their kid. It is up to them to believe me or not. I think it is the right thing to do, though. I still have so many questions that I will never have answered. I feel like everything we are working for as a society is just a lie now. What is going on here? How long have they been doing this to people? And are all these cryptid sightings just the creations of our own government? Why? Just be wary, folks. And please do not go poking your nose in places it does not belong. And Swamp Dweller, I'm going dark for a few years after I submit this. Thank you for sharing this story.
Hi, Swamp Dweller. My name is David, and I would like to tell you what happened to me a couple of years ago. I've never told anybody about my experience because I'm afraid I would be laughed at, so I'll keep my last name out of it. Anyways, it was the springtime of 2019. I was camping out in the middle of nowhere in my small cabin around my private 85-acre lake. The property has been in my family since God knows when, but it has been decades. Here in the deep south of the US, we are surrounded by nothing but local wildlife, so we do not have neighbors except the animals that inhabit Georgia. One night, I decided to go fishing for catfish with my wife sleeping in the cabin. I used my headlamp to see everything that I am doing, like getting my poles ready and into the rod holders. I was ready to catch some monster blue catfish as I was using rotted shrimp for bait. I caught a few nice ones which were about 20 to 30 pounds, but they got much bigger than that in this lake. After I had caught the fourth catfish, I heard a rustle in the woods about 60 or so yards away. Leaves were crunching from heavy footsteps. I thought it was a deer at first, so I did not think too much of it. Then I realized that this was way bigger than the average deer. Whatever it was walking in my direction, but more in the direction of the lake if I had to guess. I tried turning my head to shine the light on its whereabouts, thinking to myself, what the heck is that? I could not get a single glimpse of this thing. The next thing I know, I hear what sounds like a small tree being swung around. I do have crabapple trees, so I'm guessing that whatever this thing was trying to shake them off and eat them. Still, we do not have any creatures that will do something like that I know of, so I am more alert as I carry a gun on my right hip in its holster. The creature, or whatever it was, had finally gotten a little bit closer. I was panicking with my hand ready to unholster my gun. I was not going to let it get any closer to me as I unholstered it. I was too scared to make a noise, so I was not going to try to warn it off. My headlamp was aiming directly at it, but I still could not see it very clearly. All I know is that this thing was dark brown as I got a glimpse of its long hair. We do not have bears in this city because it's a small town in the middle of nowhere. I was convinced that this thing was a Bigfoot. The monstrous creature noticed the light from my headlamp, so I was more panicked than ever. I could not hesitate any longer. I aimed my gun right at it and took a few shots. It took off after the gunshots, and I hauled my butt back to the cabin. I never heard from it later. My wife woke up and told me she heard the gunshots, so I told her exactly what had happened. We spent the rest of the night at the cabin. I woke up the next day, and I decided to go out there where the creature was. I found large footprints on the muddy bank. It had large feet bigger than the average person. The toe shapes were unbelievable. I was sure that I had shot this thing, so I tried looking for blood trails. The thing is, there was a spurt of blood on the green leaves of a medium-sized pine tree. I tried to find out if more blood was anywhere else. I did find some on some leaves and the green grass, but the trail of blood came to a sudden stop. I did not see a body anywhere, but I did make casts of the footprints and sent them to the BFRO. They analyzed the cast and came to the conclusion that it was in fact a Sasquatch. We do not have any reports of them below the central parts of Georgia, until now.
I happen to be the first person to encounter one this far below the Appalachian Trail, according to the researchers.
I cannot believe I'm sharing this story, but I do not know if I can take this much longer without some semblance of help. I desperately hope you can use this on your channel. My name is Maxwell. I am a 16-year-old male who has been binge listening to your channel for several months, and I finally worked up the guts to send this in. I currently reside in a deadbeat coal town, specifically in the eastern coal fields of Kentucky. Sad, I know. In my area of Letcher County, there are several tales of cryptids, with thousands of small hidden caves in this little part of the Appalachia. I do not doubt that. I have heard people's encounters with crawlers and such, but there's something much, much darker. December 15th, 2019 is when things changed for me. My best friend, Dean, came clean to me about something that had been stalking him for several years. He told me that he can hear it pacing with heavy bipedal steps. It likes to stop above his bed and breathe with heavy rattling sighs. It taps on his walls and window, and it stays only in the late hours of the day and early hours of the morning. I was suspicious at first, but Dean would not lie about something like that. I told him I would try to help him figure out what it was, and it turns out I did something worse. It started out small, like the feeling of constantly being watched when I was outside. I can live with that. The feeling intensifies tenfold when I'm outside at night, though, with the added dread that it feels like something is stalking towards me quietly. I'm not a paranoid guy by any means. At least, I thought so anyway. Usually, I'm a very dense guy and don't believe in anything supernatural. I have ADHD, so it's hard to maintain enough focus to form paranoid thoughts. The second thing that happened was the walking on my roof. Heavy footsteps that sounded like something or someone was pacing. It only happened when I was home alone during the night, so semi-often. I, being the idiot I am, would just ignore it. Then the tapping. The constant, slow tapping on all the exterior walls that enclosed my bedroom. Back and forth. The taps on the window were next, then the whispers. This has been on and off for about 2 years irregularly now. Please, Swamp, get the story out there. I know it is short as all get out, but this is getting to me more and more. The pandemic is really making it harder to ignore this thing. My family, my boyfriend, they all do not know what to do, and neither do my friends. I have nobody else to turn to. My uncle thinks it's a demon, but I think it's something more cryptid. Thank you for your time, and I hope you have a good day and night. This may not be overly scary, but if your listeners have any idea of what this thing is, please let me know in the comments. Hi Swamp. This story occurred last October and was my encounter with one of Texas's oldest unsolved mysteries, the Marfa Lights. It may not be as terrifying as some of the other stories submitted here, but it was a unique experience for me. On some nights, as you look across the West Texan desert outside the town of Marfa, you see strange orbs of red, white, or yellow light floating above the desert floor. You may see only one or two, or sometimes several in the air at one time. Sometimes they hover perfectly still before blinking out, or they move, even shooting across the night sky. They are unpredictable. Stories of sightings of the lights go well back into the 1800s. There are even Native American legends about the mysterious lights, and many researchers have run studies to try to determine their cause. The leading theory is that the unique atmospheric conditions cause headlights from cars to be reflected in the sky, but a lot of people don't buy that. While on a trip with some friends from a university out west to experience the beauty of the Chihuahuan Desert, we decided to visit the viewing area,
around 10 miles outside of the small town of Marfa. At the time, we were staying there. One of my favorite hobbies is going bird watching, so I brought my big spotting scope on the trip, which I planned to use to see the lights better. We arrived about half an hour after the sunset. If you have never been far into the desert, it gets dark, and I mean dark. The only source of light was the dim lights on the steps of the viewing area, the stars, and a single cell tower out in the distance. I set up my scope and sighted it in on the cell tower. We did not have to wait long before a small white light appeared on the horizon. It moved slowly across the horizon before blinking out. Then, another one appeared, and another. Sometimes they would go out after a minute, other times they would be visible for about 5 or more minutes. Whenever I would focus my scope on one, I was never able to see any discernible features other than a small blip of light. Another strange thing to note was that whenever I would crank the zoom on my scope, the lights never seemed any larger than when looking at them with the naked eye. We stayed for about an hour, and I was absolutely entranced by the little lights, and, as luck would have it, that was not the only time we would see them on that trip. A couple of days later, we were returning from a hike in Big Bend. It was a long drive back, if I recall, so it was pretty dark by the time we were getting back to Marfa. Driving through the desert at night is surreal. You can go hundreds of miles and hardly see anything. It is like the whole world drops out of existence beyond the reach of the headlights. When we passed the viewing platform, we saw about half a dozen white, red, and yellow lights way out in the desert. The most we had ever seen at once. Where it got weird was when I turned around in my seat and saw little reddish lights behind us. There was only one though, so I did not think of it at all, and from my best guess, I would say it was about a half mile behind us, maybe 25 to 50 feet off the ground. I thought it could have been a motorcycle, but then it started moving perpendicular to the straight road we were on. It followed us for about 10 minutes if I had to guess, and from what I could tell, it kept the same distance between us and itself, before suddenly just disappearing into thin air. We all said stuff along the lines of, "Well, that was weird." None of us had ever seen anything like it, and 2 of the people in the car have been out there multiple times, and have seen the lights many times themselves, but never anything like that. We did not feel threatened by it, but it was a cool experience that many people probably have not had. If any of y'all are in West Texas, be sure to stop by Marfa and see if you can catch a glimpse of these weird lights. People have speculated that these things can be ghosts, aliens, car lights, or even electricity caused by the rocks under the area. But I really hope that the mystery of the Marfa Lights is never solved. We need a few more mysteries in the world. This just happened about an hour ago, so my memory is fresh. First off, I'm living in a very rural, small village, maybe about 10 to 15 houses max. It's very close to a highway. You can drive there within maybe 5 minutes. It's about 10 minutes away from the actual town itself. If you cross the street, it just takes you about a 10-minute walk to reach the forest. On Christmas Day, it was my first Christmas there in this area. It was sometime in the afternoon. My partner and I decided to go for a little digestive walk, as we were really stuffed from all the food. It was about 1700 hours, and already dark when we left. We had a big and bright LED flashlight with us. I also took my camera and my flash, as I love taking pictures of nature at night. We decided to walk on a little country road toward the forest and then turn right, following a small graveled cycle track close to the forest border. This eventually connects our village and the next, which is maybe about 15 to 20 minutes away. In the middle part of that track, you must walk through a small bit of forest. It is rather dark, and the trees are extremely high and quite dense. When we entered, I saw our flashlight reflecting on something and recognized a car being parked there on the side of the track, close to the trees. This struck me as a bit odd, as cars are not allowed to drive there, and the path is very narrow and hidden, so I was a bit cautious. My partner pointed the light inside of the car and it seemed to be empty. I also noticed the windows were frozen, so it must have been parked there for a good minute or so in front of the car. I spotted a tree with an intriguing structure, and I asked my partner to point the flashlight towards it so I could focus better and photograph it with my flash. After I took a few images, my partner told me, there's someone standing behind us in the middle of the road. Nobody was following us the entire way. I kept looking around and behind us occasionally as well, because at this time of night you can never be too careful, especially with all the wild boars going around. It is also mating season, so they are more aggressive than usual. Indeed, when I turned around, there was a man standing behind us, staying out of the flashlight's reach. He wasn't saying anything, just standing there and facing us. At first, I thought he might be startled, as it may seem a bit weird if someone is just taking photos of your car. It was not even legal to drive on that path with the car anyway. I decided to get up and confront him from a distance, explaining to him that I was just taking photos of the tree. He did not react and still just stood there. I then went on to ask him if he needed some light, and he replied that this was not necessary. It was odd, but I was still calm. Sure, about there being a normal explanation for his behavior, maybe. Nonetheless, my partner and I decided to just get out of there and follow the path leading to the next village. It was probably only about 7 minutes more until we reached it. I remembered the letters on his license plate, not the numbers though, unfortunately, and Googled it, and it turned out that he was from a city about 6 hours away from our village. Mind you, the country I live in is in an extremely strict lockdown right now, so you are only allowed to travel, even by car, if you have very urgent reasons. After we reached the first lantern of the next village, we looked back and observed the car driving a bit out of the forest, turning around, and going back inside. I was able to see that he parked there again, turned the lights off, and he did not leave the forest. We then went home on a much longer way than initially intended, as I did not want to go back there for obvious reasons. Our flashlight battery died on the way, and my phone battery was low, so I did not want to have to call the police back then, but I called them as soon as I arrived home and gave them all the details of that guy. My big regret is that I did not memorize the whole license plate, but it was just so surprising that I seriously did not think about it. Also, it only occurred to me as strange when I thought about the frozen windows, and that he could possibly have been there for quite a while, and somehow, he was walking behind us with nobody ever noticing for quite some time. He did seem to be sneaking up on us as well. I think I was incredibly lucky to have my partner, the camera, and the bright light with me. I do not want to imagine what could have happened if I was alone. When I told my housemate, she theorized that he may have been spying on the houses awfully close to the forest border, as you can easily investigate their backyards without being seen. I think that is probably likely. I had the thought of photographing the car when I entered the forest part of the path, but somehow, I felt just weird about that. I thought it would probably be a bit weird and disrespectful. In hindsight, I believe this saved me, as he must have been hidden behind the trees close to the car. If he was really planning on burglary, or worse, dumping a body, I think it's not likely he may have attacked me if he realized I had a potential photo of his car with a recognizable license plate. It was Christmas, 2008, and I had awoken to a bright, sunny Southern California day. Excited, full of energy, and full of emotions, prepared to head toward LAX so I could board my plane and fly across the country. That year, I was heading toward West Virginia to spend the holidays with friends and family. We would proceed to stay up every night watching movies, playing video games, and telling stories during my vacation there. I would go into more details with the fun and exciting things, including going ice skating, camping, and even feeding some deer in my friend's backyard, but I'm pretty sure you are not really interested in all that. Fair enough, let us focus on the events leading up to my scary encounter, including the experience itself. Now, the reason I chose to fly on Christmas Day was because it was way cheaper, which, fun fact, if you travel during the season, choose the 25th. As you know, most families want to already be together on Christmas Day, which is why airlines choose to lower costs for customers on the holiday. Just an FYI. Anyways, I boarded my American Airlines flight at approximately 9 in the morning, and we took off close to around 9:45. The flight itself was boring, consisting of listening to audiobooks and having small conversations with a friendly woman who sat behind me. Fast forward to a little past 7 p.m. You must remember there is a 3-hour time difference between the East and West Coast time. We arrived at the airport on schedule. It had been snowing that evening, so I bundled up in extra layers with my comfortable boots, softening each of my steps. Once I grabbed my luggage, consisting of my carry-on and small suitcase, I head toward the shuttle system just outside the airport, which was to take me roughly an hour toward the small town that my friend lives in, and drop me off at her mom and dad's bakery. We had planned it this way because my friend, who in this story we'll refer to as Amanda, and her dad would be at the bakery working on some sweets for all of us to enjoy back at her house. Do not get me wrong, they did offer to come pick me up at the airport, and they insisted heavily that it was not an issue, but I insisted further that I would take a shuttle to them. So I did, and about an hour later, I am dropped off at my friend's bakery, and I am greeted by Amanda. "Where's your dad? Is it just you?" I asked Amanda, as she helps me get the snow-covered suitcase and carry-on into the back room. "Oh, he'll be right back. He went to go get some things from home." We proceeded to settle down inside the back room and talked for about 15 minutes or so, catching up and me telling her about my flight. Bear in mind, the lights in front of the bakery, where all the sweets are, including the cash register and displays, are off, and the "We Are Open" sign is set to closed. So, anyways, as we are talking, enjoying some cookies and milk, we suddenly heard a loud thud and shattering coming from the main lobby. Amanda and I quickly jump out of our seats, and then storm through the kitchen door only to be met with one of the worst sights you could possibly imagine. 2 hunky large figures, with black ski masks covering their face, black sweaters, matching pants, gloves, and boots, are now in the bakery and are armed. One has a crowbar, and the other has a handgun. I remember everything in slow motion, my life passing before my very own eyes. As the men tell us to be quiet and to show them where the money was located, otherwise we would be in a world of trouble, Amanda tells the men the cash register was empty, but the money was in the back room and placed inside a box. The men approached Amanda and we had briefly headed into the back room, Amanda pointing at said money box placed on a table, while the men have their backs turned toward us. We take this opportunity to book it out of the bakery, jumping through the shattered front window and running across the street to a small shopping center. Naturally, everything was closed. It was Christmas after all, so the overall feeling of being isolated without anyone near us for help as it snowed in the darkness was a very real and very scary feeling. Amanda and I both hid behind a large dumpster, keeping a watchful eye on the shop. As Amanda called her dad to warn him about the 2 armed men, her dad asks us if we are safe. We assure him that we are fine and we are hidden behind a dumpster on the other side of the street. Amanda's dad then advises us to call the police. He then says he would be there in about 5 minutes with the shotgun. Too bad he did not get there in time, nor did the police, because almost as soon as we are on the line with 911, the 2 men come racing out of the bakery with the money box I mentioned and run in the complete opposite direction into an alleged alleyway. 20 seconds later, a black minivan which we assumed housed the 2 robbers was storming down the street and disappears into the cold, dark West Virginia night. Sadly for Amanda and her family, they ended up losing a few $1,000s that evening, having to cover costs for the damages and the money stolen. But when all was said and done, they were just so thankful nothing bad happened to either me or their daughter. Nothing was stolen from my belongings, which I was thankful for, as I had all their gifts wrapped neatly in my suitcase. Now, even though we stayed at the bakery longer than expected talking with the police and filing a police report, we eventually returned to Amanda's house at roughly 2 in the morning to open presents and try to get our minds off of what was truly the most frightening experiences of our lives. The police never did catch the men, but in what was perhaps one of the greatest acts of kindness, the town folks came together to help raise the funds for Amanda's family to cover the losses from that cold and scary Christmas evening. Hello, Swamp. I love your stories and I listen to them daily. This is my first time sharing a scary story, so I'm sorry if it does not meet specific standards. Anyways, today I'm going to share my encounter with what I presume to be a Sasquatch. I live in a small town in northern Illinois, and my dad and his friends decided to go camping. He asked me if I wanted to come along. Not wanting to be all alone for a prolonged period of time, I agreed. We drove about 2 hours into Wisconsin to some property we own up there. It is about 4 p.m. when we arrive. We just started setting up stuff as soon as we arrived, and we got done around 6 p.m. After that, we just hung around the campfire telling stories, playing games, and making s'mores until about 12 a.m., at that point, most of us headed off to bed. As soon as I laid down, I realized I had to use the bathroom, so I told my dad where I was going, and he ironically said, "Don't let the Sasquatch get you." And obviously, I did not take him seriously, because I thought he was joking, obviously. I am somewhat skeptical about cryptids in general, and I like to think that we needed a little bit more tangible evidence before going head over heels into something. I grabbed a headlamp and walked about a minute or two down a steep hill and dug a hole. I was about to go, but then I heard a branch snap about 30 yards away. I immediately perked up and looked around. I could not see anything past the 10 feet that the headlamp illuminated. I said, "Who's there?" or something around those lines, at which point I heard a heavy pounding and more twigs snapping. Except this time, they were closing in on me. I said F this, and started going back up the hill. I turned around to get one last look, and no more than 10 feet away was this thing. I say thing because, though I think it was a Sasquatch, I have no experience with cryptids. Anyways, this thing was at least 7 feet tall with brown hair all over its body. Its face. Oh, its face will always be imprinted into my nightmares. Its eyes were almost glowing, and its mouth was wide open, exposing vaguely human-like teeth, except they were serrated. After seeing this, I bolted, not caring what was in front of me at that point. I did not look back once until I was at my campsite. I panted as I was out of breath and turned back to see the glowing eyes at the bottom of the hill staring back. I practically leaped into my tent and laid there for what felt like an hour just listening. After I did not hear anything, I eventually dozed off until the morning and told my dad what happened. He burst out laughing. Frustrated he did not believe me, I never brought it up again. Anyways, that's my story. This happened about 2 weeks ago. I'm sorry if this is not exactly terrifying to you, but it certainly was to me. I'm a short 5'2" female living in Colorado. I'm 18 now, but this story happened when I was just 14. And all the way leading up to last year. I've been living with my grandfather a few towns over from the rest of my family since the summer of my freshman year of high school. My first summer here started well, working with my grandpa and making a little bit of money here and there, but I was happy being alone for the most part. After spending the last 13 or so years in a house full of 5 people, it was nice to be in a house where I had my own space and a room with a big bed. I thought it would be nice being in a smaller town where I did not really know anyone and can make new friends, kind of refresh. My grandpa invited me to go to a town dinner with him one evening, and I did not have anything better to do, so I went with him and was already uncomfortable in the room full of people that I did not know. So after I finished eating, I went outside to sit on the swing at the park. After sitting there for about 10 minutes or so, I heard some rocks moving behind me and turned to see a man walking around the swings. He was in his early 20s, and he was wearing a nice dress shirt, but it was wrinkled and stained, and his pants were the same. When he noticed I saw him, he said, "Hey," in a very calm voice. Me being raised to be polite and not to ignore people, I talked to him for a few minutes until the dinner was over and my grandpa drove around the park to pick me up. It was not until the next few months that I realized I made a big mistake talking with him that night. After I started school in that town, my grandpa was short on help and decided to hire that man to work with him. In my grandpa's words, that boy's ladder doesn't go all the way to the top. meaning he was not very smart and did very dumb things without realizing they were dangerous during work. Every time I would run into him in town, I would pretend like I did not see him, and I would hurry and run to somewhere to hide until he left. A few weeks later, my grandpa fired him and gave him his last check. Later that week, the man showed up at our house asking to get his job back, and my grandpa said he already got new help and did not want to see him there anymore. The man paused and then asked my grandpa if I was home. My grandpa ignored this question and shut the door. I thought that was the last time I would hear anything about him. But unfortunately, I was wrong. In the next few months, my grandpa had hired new people to help him, and they knew that man. After school one day, my grandpa randomly told me to be sure to avoid that man every time I saw him. I told him I had been, but asked why he was so suddenly concerned about it again. He then told me something that made me sick to my stomach. The man had told the people that worked with my grandfather that he was in love with a 14-year-old and that he was going to marry her, but her grandfather doesn't know it yet. They intuitively knew he was talking about me and told my grandpa what he had said. My grandpa was so angry, I thought he was going to kill him. The next year I was outside smoking, enjoying the night air, and enjoying the stars when I suddenly saw him right in front of my porch. I threw my cigarette and ran inside, locking the door behind me and yelling for my grandpa, telling him that the man was just in the yard walking up to me. My grandpa grabbed his gun and went outside, but he could not find him anywhere. The next day, my grandpa went to that man's grandmother's house to tell her that her grandson was trespassing, and he would not hesitate to shoot him if he ever came up into the yard again. I'd never heard anything about that guy for quite a few years, and I thought that was going to be the end of dealing with him. But this last year, shortly after my 18th birthday, I was sitting at home in bed, and I get a Facebook message request from a random account with a name I did not know. I open the messages, and it is a bunch of disgusting messages with pictures and a video. I checked the username that was used to create the account, and it was him. I freaked out and started crying and called my oldest sister, and she told me to screenshot the messages and send them to our mother so she could take them as evidence of harassment and go to the police. I did, and now I'm just hoping it's over for good.
Me and my family always go on an exceptionally long summer trip every year around the major cities of America. It is always a blast, but I do not think I will ever forget this experience. We were around the halfway point of our vacation, traveling on back roads of Texas. Instead of stopping somewhere to rest, my dad decided to continue through the night. I dozed off sometime around 11 p.m. I woke up later when I felt the car come to a stop. I opened my eyes to see my dad with a random dude under the hood of an old truck. I could see as our car's headlights were facing the truck. The thing that caught my eye was on both sides of the road in these ditches were 3 people trying to hide in them, with different types of sharp weapons. I almost crapped my pants, but instead, I jumped out of the car and screamed, "Hey Dad, the gun fell out of the holder." Both my dad and the man looked at me confused. I told my dad to come over, and I whispered the situation. His eyes lit up before we were both startled by the strange man. "My car is still broken." My dad answered by stating that he was going to move our car closer. Me and my dad got in and zoomed out of there. We noticed in our back mirrors that a car was following us for quite some time, but it soon gave up. Me and my dad were wide awake for the rest of the drive. My mom was somehow asleep the entire time, and we did not want to worry her, so we kept it to ourselves. We had a great time for the rest of the trip, and me and my dad were a lot closer after that incident. Now, I need to mention after the trip I read an article online that a couple were kidnapped and are still missing around the area that this incident happened. I don't know if the crimes were connected, but nevertheless, we were lucky. So this story is going to be parted from my perspective as well as my brother's perspective, and it's going to be a long one. This is a story that happened last night while I was at my grandma's house. So before this all took place,
I went to get McDonald's in the nearest city to us, which is about a 20-minute drive. After that, I decided to go down to my grandma's house instead of going straight home. For context, she lives down a long farm road, to which you also must turn down a half-mile dirt driveway just to get to her house. I arrived there at around 9 p.m., and I went in and visited my grandmother and my brother who also lives with her. Ever since my grandfather passed away, he has lived there so that she will not have to live down there all alone. My brother and I took my grandma's dog to pee around 10:30 p.m. We just sat outside listening to music and talking for a while. At that point, I was starting to get cold because this is East Texas after all, and I'm not yet used to it. Getting down into the low 40s at night is definitely something that takes some time getting acquainted to. So, I was about ready to head inside. I noticed something moving in the corner of my eye. It was around the large metal shop that sits a few hundred yards away from the house. I did not really take too much notice though, because it is not uncommon for deer or raccoons to come snooping around in the yard, and plus my grandma's dog was not barking, so I thought that it might have just been my eyes playing tricks on me. We finally headed back inside, and my grandma went to sleep around 11 p.m. So me and my brother stayed up and played Among Us and watched YouTube for a while. At around 2:30 a.m., I was exhausted and ready to go home, so I asked my brother to walk with me to the door and make sure that I get out to my car, because I am always a very paranoid person, especially at night. He joked around and said that he would turn the light off on me and lock the door. I freaked out and begged him to walk me out to the car, to which he finally humored me. I got in my car and immediately locked the doors, and I saw the porch light turn off as I was driving back down the dirt road. I got home within 10 minutes and fixed myself some ice cream before I sat down and enjoyed some creepy horror stories on YouTube. Another 15 or so minutes passed and I got a FaceTime call from my brother, to which I picked up almost immediately. I could tell that he was freaked out about something, but he was not saying anything right away. I asked him what was wrong. The following is my best attempt to paraphrase what my brother told me. He said that after I left, he went back outside to listen to some music and sit on the porch. He had the music on his phone up pretty loud, which would usually make any noises of the animals coming from the nearby woods not very noticeable. After just a few minutes of listening to music, he said that he heard what he thought to be sounds of metal banging around, so he quickly paused the music and listened to see if he could hear the sound again. He stood up and looked towards the shop and the boat shed, which are adjacent to each other and are a few hundred yards away from where he was standing. He saw a faint light shining around near the boat shed, but then it quickly flicked off. At this point, he was freaking out, so he quietly crept back inside the house and locked the door behind him. He said that he ran to his room in the back of the house. I guess he was not trying to wake up our grandma, and he grabbed his revolver. He quickly ran back outside and saw the glow of the flashlight move around and then quickly shut off as soon as he noticed it. He walked out to the edge of the concrete carport and stared out towards the boat shed with his revolver down at his side. The only thing illuminating the boat shed was the faint light coming from the house. He said that he tried to muster up the most intimidating voice he could manage and said, "Who the hell is out there?" To which there was no immediate reply except for a slight bumping sound which solidified the fact that someone was indeed there. Now keep in mind, this is in the middle of the country in a town with a population of just over 1,000 people, and the nearest house is across the lake a couple of miles down. Also, it's pretty late at night. My grandma has had problems with people snooping around the property in the past, so this is not something any of us take very lightly, and for the life of me, I cannot tell you why my brother did not just call the police, but you also have to remember that there is literally one cop in our entire town, and it is 3 a.m., and so it would take at least 30 minutes for the cops to even show up. So anyway, my brother again called for the person to show themselves and repeated his question, and asked the person to identify. He said that he practically crapped his pants when this tall, lanky figure slowly emerged from the boat shed with a flashlight in hand. Although my brother could not see any distinct features about the person, he could tell that it was an older man and that it was no one that we knew. It was especially not anyone that should be in our boat shed at 3 a.m. At this point, he raised the revolver up and pointed it at the man and again shouted, "Who are you?" The man was still silent and began slowly walking towards him. My brother pulled back the hammer of the revolver and gave one last verbal warning to the man and said, "I swear, I will blow your damn head off. Now, who are you and why are you here?" The man quickly raised his hands and said, Whoa, calm down, man," in a taunting voice as he continued walking towards my brother. My brother fired a single shot just above the man's head, which he finally took as his cue that my brother meant business. The man took off like a bat out of hell down the driveway, and my brother screamed, "Next time I won't miss." My brother then quickly ran inside to wake up my grandma, who had somehow slept through the entire commotion. She did not seem worried enough to call the police, but of course after hearing this, all I could think about was what were the true intentions of that man. Was he just some meth head snooping around looking for something to steal, trying to get some drug money? Or were his intentions much more sinister? Another question that haunts me about this whole situation is how many times this happened after my grandma and brother went to bed, and we just did not know. And was he watching us from the shadows all night? Was he watching me as I walked out to my car? What would have happened if my brother had turned the lights off and locked the door before I could get to my car? So I hope that stranger who tried to rob us or do God knows what at 3 o'clock in the morning learned their lesson. Because my parents had separated before I was born, I spent my time growing up between each of their houses. Each summer, until I turned 19, I stayed with my dad in rural Missouri. He had grown up in the area himself, and most of his family still lived there. Without much to do, like going to the movies and stuff, I would fill my days hanging out with my older cousins and getting into mischief. Many of our long summer days were filled with wandering the surrounding woods. On one of these journeys, we came across a big lake sitting quietly by itself out in the middle of nowhere. The water was crystal clear and filled with tons of monstrous fish. We asked the adults if they were aware of its existence, but none of them have ever heard of it. That was more than likely the reason why it had so many big fish. No one living in the area had fished it, and anyone who had in the past allowed its location to be lost. We would fish the pond 3 or 4 times, coming away with a stringer full of lunkers on each occasion. On the 5th occasion, we hoped to accumulate enough for a big family fish fry. The summer holiday was starting to wind down, and we figured a fish fry would be a great way to cap it off. It was a warm Saturday morning when we headed out. We started about an hour before sunup because the walk-in took about an hour. Besides, the fish stopped biting by the hottest part of the day, and we hoped to get back to my dad's house by early afternoon. The beautiful side of the pond came into view around dawn. It did not take long for us to get our first bites, and for the next 3 hours, the fish came quickly, one after another. Our limit was caught by 10:45, and I was rearing to get going. We had a nearly 90-minute walk back with 2 5-gallon buckets packed to the top with fish, so I imagined another 30 would be added to that. To my displeasure, my cousin thought it would be refreshing to take a dip in the lake before we left. He tried to pressure me into joining him, but I did not know how to swim at the time. I just wanted to get back, but he was older than me, so he was in charge. I plopped my tail into a rock and waited while he was doing his thing. There was an old rope tied to a tree, probably from 100 years ago, and he wanted to swing from it. It looked unsafe to me. However, my concerns were laughed off, and he stripped down to his boxers, getting his clothes on the ground next to me, and climbed the tree to get onto that rope. He pushed off, swung out just a short distance before the rope snapped right above him. He made it out far enough to hit the deep water, but probably not as far as he intended. When he hit the water, his body made a dull thud sound. It didn't sound normal, and it likely hurt. I was planning on laughing at him and saying I told you so, but as the seconds passed, he never resurfaced. The situation was quickly becoming scary. I looked around to see if he came up somewhere farther away, perhaps floating unconscious because of the hard contact with the water, but still I saw nothing. I was beginning to panic and waded out as far as I dare, looking into the water for him. Unfortunately, the water came cloudy with every step I took, and it was impossible to see. Soon, it was clear to me that he had drowned. How? I had no idea. Perhaps if I could have swum back then, I could have been able to help him. But it's too late now. I was helpless to do anything more than pack up and head home. On the entire walk back, the small nugget of hope lingered in the back of my mind that he had tricked me and would pop up at some point. This did not happen, however, and the dread I carried of telling my family grew with every step. I tried several times to find the words, but with each attempt, I would just break down and choke on my tears. Ultimately, I could only manage. Mark drowned. They got the point after that, and once I was able to pull myself together, I led my dad and uncle back to the pond. Mark's body was still nowhere to be found. With no other options, we went to the sheriff's office to report the drowning. When I realized where we were headed, I started freaking out. In my young mind, I thought I was going to get in trouble or blamed for my cousin's death. It took a few minutes, but they were able to convince me I was not in any trouble. Even after they had, I could not help but feel guilty every time I looked at my uncle. Regardless of what he claimed, I could not help but believe he blamed me. Even if it was just a small amount, I explained what happened to the sheriff, and the search began the next morning. Just by chance, that was the day I was going back to my mom's. That Monday night, my mom sat me down to tell me a team of divers had found Mark's body earlier that day. When they discovered him, one of his feet was hung up on a sunken log, so they assumed that's why he never surfaced. I wish I could say that made me feel better, but it did not. It did, however, serve as a catalyst to learn how to swim. The guilt of not being able to help my cousin stayed with me for a long time. I never wanted to be in that position of not being able to help another person ever again. So in a twisted kind of way, his death had a positive impact on my life. However, if I had the choice, I'd prefer he still be with us.
This story takes place when I was around 15 years old or so. It was the beginning of summer, and my family planned to take a 2-hour road trip to visit my aunt and uncle for the weekend. This visit was especially exciting as my other aunts, uncles, and younger cousins were meeting us there. My aunt and uncle lived in what I would call a cliché haunted-looking house. It was 2 stories tall with an attic, white with chipped paint, a cornfield in the backyard, no neighbors in sight, and sat along a rocky road. Although this house would make the perfect setting for a horror film, I honestly never got any weird vibes. Flash forward to that evening, my parents, aunts, and uncles were going to make the 15-minute trip into town to grab some drinks at the local bar. My sisters, cousins, and I ended up lounging around the living room and watching movies. I'm a total night owl, surrounded by early birds, so I ended up being the last one to fall asleep. It was around midnight and I was not planning on sleeping anytime soon. I decided this would be a perfect time to call my boyfriend since I finally had some privacy. I was lying on the couch in the living room with my flip phone pressed hard to my ear, barely able to hear my boyfriend because of the poor reception. As I was lying there, on my phone, I heard a long, slow creak come from the hallway on the other side of the wall. I just assumed the adults were already home, and the creaking sound came from the kitchen, where the front door was. I quickly hung up the phone as I did not want my parents to ask who I was talking to this late. I laid there for a few seconds before realizing there was nobody there. I got up and walked around the corner. Fear took over my body as I saw that the door leading down to the dark basement was open. I was frozen in place for a second. I ran to the door, slammed it shut, and raced to the living room and jumped back onto the couch. Nobody ever goes into the basement. It is completely unfinished, with dirt floors, and only holds a washer, dryer, and some miscellaneous junk. My cousins and sisters were all still asleep in my uncle's bedroom that is connected to the living room. The more I thought about it, the more I started to freak out. I decided to lay down in the bedroom with everyone else. The whole house was completely dark except for a little nightlight in the kitchen. I did not feel comfortable in that room because it did not have a real door. I think it was originally a dining room that they had turned into a bedroom. I was lying on my side, facing the swinging saloon doors that led into the kitchen. A few minutes went by and I saw a human-sized shadow move behind the swinging saloon doors. I'm not sure how I fell asleep that night, but somehow I did eventually. A couple of years later, not due to related events, my aunt and uncle moved out of that house. One weekend, while visiting their new place, I walked in on my aunt and my mom talking about the old house. I told her what happened that night and she said that strange things have happened to them as well. For example, she has heard footsteps upstairs in the middle of the day when she is home alone. I never really pegged her as someone who believed in the paranormal, so I was surprised to hear that she reached out to the original homeowners. They informed my aunt that the house is extremely old and has a lot of history. One of the things that I can remember her saying is that a young boy accidentally shot himself upstairs. Apparently some people have reported seeing a young boy looking out of a small window on the second floor. I know this is not a super spooky story, but I have never experienced anything like that before or since. For as long as I can remember, I have always believed in the paranormal but have always held a lot of skepticism. I absolutely loved that house and had such great memories out there, but ever since then, it gives me an eerie feeling. Every time I drive home from visiting my aunt and uncle, I have to pass by that house. They only moved a few miles down the road. This happened to me about 2 years ago now, but I think about it a lot. Even to this day, I get so scared when I think about it and what might have happened if my dad was not there. During this time, I was going to grad school in Texas and was visiting my family in Kansas City. I had just finished my visit and was driving back to Texas. I started my drive and about an hour in I got a flat tire. I called my dad and he told me to call roadside assistance and he would be there with AAA. He got there and roadside assistance put my spare on and we went off to the nearest Walmart to get a new tire. The nearest Walmart was about 20 miles away. As we were in a rural part of Kansas, I was following my dad, driving about 55 miles per hour since I was on a spare. There were not a lot of cars on the highway, basically just me and my dad. My dad was a little bit ahead of me, so I don't think it was apparent I was following him. Somewhere along the drive, I noticed a dark-colored SUV behind me. He was flashing his lights at me, swerving onto the shoulder and then back into his lane. He was accelerating so he was very close to my car and then would fall back a bit. From the time I noticed him, he did this for about 4 or 5 miles, which is a long time when you are in the moment. I was about to call my dad because I felt like this was incredibly strange. As I said, I was in a rural area, and there were no cars around. If this guy were upset, I was driving so slowly, he could have just gotten into the left lane and passed me. But he continued to flash his lights, tailgate me, and swerve onto the shoulder. At this point, my dad saw what was happening, took an exit, and parked on the shoulder. I followed. This exit was not one that we needed to take. It was a rural exit onto a gravel road, and I do not think it was used very frequently. Lo and behold, the guy followed me as well. I pulled behind my dad, who was already out of the car with his arms in the air, saying, "What the hell?" At this point, I think the guy finally realized that I was not truly alone. He slowed down, looked at both of us, hesitated for a second, and then he took a hard left onto the gravel road and took off. At this point, I thought about trying to get his license plate, but I was way too slow. The dust from the gravel road made it impossible to see his license plate anyway. I still kick myself for not looking at his license plate sooner. I know this may not be the scariest story that you've shared, but the situation really scared me. We called the police to report it, but there was not much they could do since we did not have a license plate number. However, I did learn that if I'm ever in this situation again, to call Highway Patrol, not 911. When you're on the highway, you travel through so many jurisdictions that it's better just to call the Highway Patrol directly. A little background, as it's been years since this encounter. I am a 28-year-old male, now residing in Georgia, but at the time of this encounter I was about 13 in South Mississippi.
Many years ago, my parents had gotten divorced. When my parents split, my dad moved in with my grandmother along with my younger brother in Mississippi. My mom had moved across state lines to Alabama, so no more than 40 miles apart though. I decided to move in with my mom but visited my dad every weekend because they agreed upon joint custody. Now, where my dad and my grandmother lived, that road had a lot of relatives of ours living down the road. Now, far from the beginning of the road to the end is honestly about 15 or 20 miles, but our relatives lived starting with us at the beginning, and the last relative lived about 2 miles deep on that same road. Pretty much, the first 2 miles of this road was all my family. So, riding bikes or walking was quite common for us kids at the time. Also, there were not many worries because we were out in the middle of nowhere, so there was not many people to really encounter. My last relative of this 2-mile stretch was by far my favorite to visit at this part in my life. My aunt and uncle had lived there along with my cousin who was only 3 years older than me. My cousin and I were extremely close. I mean so close. Every time I would visit my dad, I would go there, visit for about 30 minutes, and then walk or ride my bike back to my cousin's. I adored him and my aunt and uncle. We were big into Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, and cool stuff like that. Anything that was popping in the early 2000s, we had a slice of it. Sorry for rambling, just painting the picture. So, I get to my dad's Saturday morning. We hang out for about 30 minutes and decided to ring up my cousin. Mind you, it's summer transitioning to autumn, to which of course he is home. I get permission and start my trek, alone mind you. I cannot remember why I did not have my bike, but I remember it not being there. As I start walking, clouds get gray and it begins to drizzle and sprinkle. I'm not too worried about it because I am halfway there already, and my clothes should not get soaked at that point. As I pass by my relative's home, before I get to my cousin's, there is a long curve that swings right. Once, directly in the center of this curve, it's nothing but trees, dense brush on both sides of you with no houses in sight. Again, if center to your left, before the brush thickens, there is a small patch of grass about 3 to 4 feet high. I am walking, and once I get to this curve, as I get to the center of the curve, the rain gets a bit heavier. As the rain hits the pavement, I am tightening my shirt collar around my neck to help keep dry. As I am doing so, I start hear rustling sounds in the small patch of the grass next to me. Thinking it could just be a deer, I turn left and see it. It was big, tall, humanoid-like. It was some sort of creature. It had its back to me, walking oddly slowly into the woods. It was about 7 foot tall and approximately 30 feet away from me. I froze and I just stared at it. It was completely engulfed with hair. Black hair, and down its back on the left and right side had a thin white vertical line running down both sides. Now this might sound stupid, but it looked like a 7 foot tall stand on 2 legs, with no tail. As soon as it got to the wood line, I absolutely booked it. I remember running on the center yellow lines of the road to help me make my escape quicker, and the rain helped with that as well. As I escaped the curve and it straightened out, I could see my cousin's place, and I did not stop running until I reached the house. I tried to tell my cousin about it and my family, but everyone just wrote it off. I mean, I was only 13, had no proof, and phones nowadays did not really exist then. And if they did, we could definitely not afford it. So no one believed me. I never walked down that road again, though. Now that I am older and moved out of state, about twice a year I go down and visit some family around that very road, and every time I pass that curve, I look to see if I can see it again. This is something scary that happened to me on New Year's Eve of 2013. That night, I accompanied a few friends to a restaurant and club downtown for a New Year's party. I had been feeling a little under the weather all day, but met them at the club regardless. Around 15 till midnight, I couldn't kid myself any longer and let them know I was heading home. The parking lot was very dark, so I pulled a small flashlight out that I carried with me. I usually kept it in my pocket and used it to light my path. As I turned the corner of the building, I caught notice of noise off to my left between two parked cars. When I reached the area, I shone my light onto the location of the noise and saw a man crouched over on the ground. I asked him if he needed any help with something, partly from suspicion, and he said yes. He claimed he had dropped his keys and could not find them in the dark, and asked if I could shine my light over to where he was to help them. Everything about the situation seemed legit, so I put my fears aside and began helping him. I crouched down next to him while he searched the area under the car. A few minutes passed and we were unable to locate the keys. Switching places with the man, I aimed the beam further and under the car. Doing this caused me to lean down further than I had to at that point. This is when I felt a hard crack against the back of my head. I remember the feeling of my face hitting the pavement, but that was all for a moment. I was probably only unconscious for a few seconds because I began waking up while I was being flipped over on my back. When my eyes opened, I saw a guy I did not recognize going through my pockets. He just pulled my wallet out of my back pocket and handed it to the other guy, the one I had been helping. Then, I watched as he pulled out my pocket knife out of my front right pocket and flicked it open. It had one of those assisted openings that makes it a little bit easier to open up real quick, kind of like a switchblade. He began waving it around in my face and asked me what my plans were for it. It was not a big knife or anything. The blade was maybe 3 inches long, and I carried it to use as a daily tool, like opening boxes at work and stuff like that. I had never viewed it as a real weapon until that moment. It was not big, but it was sharp enough to cut my throat. I could not say anything back to him. Even though I was now fully awake, I was too afraid to do anything. He continued waving it around and laughing. Fortunately for me, a group of men and women had just arrived and noticed what was going on. One of the men yelled out, "Hey, what are you dudes doing to him?" They must have been afraid of the number of people in the group and ran off down the street. A couple of the guys checked me out to make sure I was okay while the others called 911. The first responders arrived a few minutes later, and I went to the ER in the meat wagon. I was happy to hear I only had a slight concussion and would be allowed to go home later that morning. A female in the group had been kind enough to go into the club and tell my friends what had happened, and they arrived soon after I did. They cut me loose with nothing more than a headache. A few hours later, I got a ride home. I only spoke to the police briefly that night to give them a report, but it was not until the following day when I got any information. My knife had been found across the parking lot from where I had been assaulted, but I never got it back because it was quote-unquote evidence in an open investigation. They had also found my wallet down the street from the club, but nothing was in it. The iPhone I was carrying at the time never surfaced, but I had insurance on it and got another one. I still have no idea where the flashlight went to, and the 2 guys that assaulted me still have not been found, and I do not expect they ever will be. The incident had me pretty messed up for a few years, but I eventually realized I was still alive and that was the most important thing. Despite this, I will probably never be able to come to the assistance of another person I do not know without being very afraid. Just to be safe, I think I will mind my own business from now on. Better safe than sorry, you know? One little phone call can change a life. But for Karen Faulkner, 3 telephone calls changed her life in a way she will never, ever forget. 2 of the 3 were made within just a couple of hours of each other on the 1st of January, 1993. The first was from her mother, informing her that her older sister had gone missing after celebrating at a New Year's Eve party. The second was even worse news. The call came from her father, telling her a body had been found. Karen's sister Kimberly had been murdered. Over the next 18 years, Karen and the Faulkner family had grieved, come to terms with their loss, and eventually put it behind them. Until one fateful day, when the phone rang. The story of Kimberly Jean Duncan's murder is as random as it is horrific. She was a young woman, just 30 years of age. She was married with 2 young children in Aloha, northeast Portland. She and her husband had been invited to a New Year's party. However, Duncan went alone because her husband had picked up a back injury and was immobilized with extreme pain. But as the night crawled into the wee hours of the morning, Kimberly had failed to arrive long after she was due to arrive home. Naturally, her husband began to grow irritated. It was not unusual for her to be a little bit late, due to drunken revelry and whatnot, but after hours and hours of unexplained absence, her husband went from irritable to downright worried. He grabbed his cell phone and began to call a few mutual friends who he knew would also be at the party. Eventually one answered, but his question on his wife's whereabouts were met with confusion. She had left the party hours before, sober as a judge, to get home for the time she had promised. Meanwhile, a stationary vehicle was spotted by a member of the public, parked in a neighborhood not too far from where Kim had been attending the New Year's Eve party. Initially, the person who spotted it guessed that the figure that lay motionless behind the steering wheel was just too drunk to drive and decided to sleep it off. But when the car was still there the following morning, they called the police. When the cops arrived, they discovered the slumped figure was dead. They had been shot once in the head at close range. Officers fished around the vehicle for some form of ID. When they found some, the name on the card was Kimberly Jean Duncan. After an impromptu autopsy, Karen Faulkner learned that her recently deceased sister had traces of narcotics in her bloodstream. This led local police to theorize that she could have been involved with violent drug dealers. That fact left Karen highly conflicted. Given that Kim had dabbled with drugs in high school, even struggled with addiction at one point, but had recently been telling her family that she was clean and sober. Despite her troubled past, Karen figured the best way to honor her sister would be to keep her memory alive. She needed to figure out what happened to her, and more importantly, who killed her. But when she called the cold case homicide unit to find out where the case stood, she discovered they had absolutely nothing. They also had a caseload of 273 investigations, with just 3 full-time detectives. Karen could do the math. They were hideously overloaded with work. Months later, Karen called again. Same status. She called again. Within the unit, she became known as a bit of a pest. On one call, however, she reached a detective newly assigned to cold cases. He told Karen to call whenever she wanted, and he would keep her informed of any developments. This kind of personal touch meant a lot to her. Her sister had been a living, breathing person, not an item that had been stolen or a piece of property that had been damaged. It was during one of these conversations with the new officer that she learned about a certain deck of playing cards. The unit sergeant had just come back from a national police convention, where he had learned that some police agencies were using the cards to solve cold case murders. Each card featured the victim's face, some details, and a number to call. The cards were distributed to jails and prisons with the hopes that an inmate might remember something. Faulkner made it her mission to get her sister's case on one of those 52 cards. She called, and she pestered, and she called again. When the first deck of cards was placed in Oregon's institutions, Duncan's case was featured on the 10 of diamonds. 2 years later, an inmate was playing cards in Oregon Penitentiary. This inmate held the 10 of diamonds in his hand. He read about the case, and by pure coincidence, something about it sounded strangely familiar to him. If he could provide the authorities with pertinent information, it could be a bargaining chip on his case. Authorities agreed to work with him. On pretense, they moved the man to a hospital, had him wear an undercover wire, and listened as he called his old friend to come see him. In the hospital room, he got his friend to talk about the case. Days later, authorities made an arrest. That is when Karen Faulkner received the third phone call. On the 15th of June 2010, Karen was driving on the freeway when her cell phone rang. The cold case detective told her to get her family together and come right away. We walked into a room and everyone was standing and waiting for us, she said. The original detective who had worked the case was retired, but he was there. He had tears in his eyes. The family was told at 8:20 a.m. that very morning authorities had arrested Brad Richard Ballantyne, a 37-year-old, in connection with the murder. More than a year later, on Thursday, July 7th, Ballantyne pleaded guilty. The family knew who, but not why. Before sentencing, Ballantyne agreed to meet with the family in a jury room on the 5th floor of the Multnomah County Courthouse. After all these years, we had the chance to confront him, Faulkner said. He said he had seen my sister at the store when she was leaving after getting some cigarettes. She pulled something out of her pocket, and some money fell on the ground. He wanted to rob her. Brad Ballantyne wanted to get her out of sight, so he flirted with her and asked her to get in her car and followed him up the street. She was probably drunk, Faulkner said. So she did. Ballantyne parked his car in front of hers. He came back to Duncan's car. He said she got mad, Faulkner related. I think she must have realized something was wrong. He said she was disrespectful. He walked back to his car and got a gun. He came back and shot her. He fled with $68. I'll tell you what I'll never forget, Faulkner said. He told us she never saw it coming. Karen's father died a year later. Her mother is still alive. I wanted my parents to know what happened to their daughter, Karen had said. I wanted them to know the killer had been caught. She'd be proud of me, Faulkner said, admitting she still thinks of her sister often. She would have been as tenacious as I was if it had been the other way around. This happened on New Year's Eve 2016 in Ixtapa, Mexico. My family and I go there every year to spend the holidays since we own an apartment there, and it allows my dad to escape his work environment for a little bit. The apartment we own is an apartment complex that has 24 in total, divided into 4 towers. They all look the same and have a small terrace with a small hot tub in the corner. Since we have owned that apartment for a few years, my parents became close with a lot of the other residents, which created a nice environment to be during the holidays. Anyway, on the New Year's Eve, we were invited with many of the other residents to spend New Year's at one of their apartments. Around 35 people or so showed up, if I had to guess. The apartment is on the 4th floor of the building, and we arrived there at around 10 p.m., since many of us had had dinner before with my family and joined to celebrate the New Year for the rest of the night. At around 10:50 or 11 p.m., one of my mother's friends looked up to the sky and said she saw something rather strange. Many of the residents, myself included, shrugged it off at first and kept on talking. Within just a couple of minutes, though, more and more people started looking up. Once we saw the commotion, we got up and went outside to the terrace to join them and see what the fuss was all about. It was kind of strange at first, but I can describe it as if the stars were twinkling. We could see stars, but these were bunched up closer than usual, and they were twinkling intermittently in an unusual fashion. As we kept looking more and more, these stars kept showing up and twinkling. Some were just saying that they were stars, and we were staring at nothing. But that's when we saw the stars begin to move in the sky. They weren't just twinkling now. They were moving all about. At this point, we all started to freak out a little bit. I like to think we are not alone, and that there are paranormal forces out there, but this was truly the first time I had no idea what was going on, or what I was witnessing. There were too many to count, but we all agreed there was around 100 to 150 quote-unquote stars that were twinkling and moving in one section of the sky. It was like they were all joining together, and once they stopped, they continued to twinkle in an unnatural way. I just can't explain it. It's as if it was turning lights on and off, and not the slight dimness you would see when it's an actual star. Then this entire cluster moved across the sky and disappeared. We were all just staring with our mouths wide open. Many of us try to record or take pictures, but nothing shows up on the phone cameras, especially that far away. The fact that it was 35 or so people witnessing it, and only about an hour after we got there, means that we definitely saw what we saw. No one was intoxicated to the point to where they could have imagined it. The most interesting part is that the son of the apartment owner said that the year before he talked to a guy that said he had seen something similar on New Year's Eve the year before. He said he listened to the story but shrugged it off as some guy ranting. My family and I continue to talk about it to this day. We immediately tried to investigate phenomena or events that could have caused it, and nothing has come up so far. I'm not sure if anybody listening to this show has any information on this, but I'd love to share it anyway and see if somebody could provide some type of insight. Sorry for the long story, but that was the most concise way I could explain it. I know some people say these stories are true for immersion, but believe me when I say this is 100% true. 3 of my friends and I were spending the night together on New Year's Eve about a year ago, and we decided we wanted to spend the night in a tent outside, really close to the woods. We were laughing and messing around, normal teenage things. Then, we heard this rustling outside in the leaves. Figuring it was just an animal or something, we shrugged it off. At this point, it was nearing midnight, and we had a flashlight on in the tent and we were blasting music. That is when all hell broke loose. We heard this chirping noise outside. When I say chirping, I do not mean it sounded like a bird or a raccoon, but this unearthly chirping that did not sound like any animal at all. In fear, we were about to be ambushed. I demanded my friends temporarily turn off the lights and the music. At first, they looked at me like I was crazy, but I strengthened my tone. Turn it all off, now! At this point, they knew I was serious, so they turned it all off and listened. There it was again, this unearthly chirping that did not sound like anything. My friends and I were dropping bricks, but I was a little bit braver than the rest of them. I had been taking karate for about 4 years, and I'm a very tall female capable of taking down a grown man. So I figured I could take whatever was out there, or at least I could carry one of my friends if we had to run away. They all tried to play it cool and said it must have been one of those screamer firework things, but I could tell they were all soiling themselves. We carried on screwing around for a few more minutes, desperately trying to forget about the screech chirping thing outside. Then we heard it again. This time, though, much closer to our tent. This was the first time I could properly hear it. When it made a clearer sound, reality drop-kicked me in the stomach. It was big, and it was almost right outside of our tent. My friends and I were about to freak out. So, they started asking me questions as to what I thought it was. I was the friend who was into all things paranormal, and I guess you could still say I am. But I have never been a paranoid person. So, they asked me. I told them, just as a suggestion, that it could be a skinwalker or a fleshgate, because I read somewhere that they like to mock the voices of your friends and like to emit strange noises. I only said this because I thought that might help them get over the scream chirp thing, but I think they were really scared. We heard it again. At this point, everyone was dropping bricks again, and one of them eventually called her older brother to come and hang out with us for a while. While he was there, just our luck, we could not hear the chirp screech anymore. Of course. We hung out with him for a while until we all decided to go on a walk with him. The walk was fun, and my friends were terrified because we were walking around in the pitch black. Oddly, maybe this is strange on my part, but I have always liked the dark. As it was so vast and mysterious, I was also low-key hoping we would find the flesh gate so my friends would stop acting like stuck-up little turds that weren't quote-unquote scared because I could see they were crapping themselves. Part of me was also pretty scared to see what would happen if we stumbled across a flesh gate. But her older brother had a knife with him, and I was prepared to stab it if he were not. Fast forward into the night. We were blasting music again and playing with a multicolored strobe light. Probably not the best way to avoid being jumped in the middle of the night. Now that I think about it, it was probably downright stupid to have it at all. My friend's brother had left us his knife in case we heard anything strange that night. It made us feel more comfortable. My friends all decided that I was the only one who would be brave enough to stab someone or something if it came down to it, so I oversaw holding the 6-inch knife all night. Thankfully, it was in a sheath, because despite my training, I am quite clumsy, especially this late into the night. I could not help taking the knife out of the sheath because it was so interesting and absolutely beautiful. There it was again. The same chirp screech. I unzipped the tent to look, knife drawn, and heard something scurry away quickly into the woods. Since my friends did not hear it, I left it alone and said nothing. Everything was fine for the rest of the night. That is, until I was the only one awake. I heard this horrible scream howl, much more blood-curdling than the chirps. It kept getting closer to the tent, and then backing away like it somehow knew I was the only one awake. It circled us, made itself sound more distant than it really was, then came back with another howl. One of my friends briefly awoke and told me it was probably someone having a party, but I could tell she was just saying that so she could get to sleep. Me, however, I could go for 3 days straight without having to sleep. I was perfectly fine without sleep unless I had a long day of school the next day or something. Believe me, when I say I did not let my guard down once, I listened to this thing in the location the cries took place. I was not about to let some flesh gate or whatever this thing was come and kill my friends and me on a night that was supposed to be fun. It's New Year's. We're not supposed to be scared, we're supposed to have fun. I drew the knife a few times and practiced slashing the air in case it attacked. But luckily, it never did. The thing just spent hours taunting me, trying to draw me out. I was incredibly tempted to run out there just to get a look at it, but I knew that is exactly what it wanted. Wanting for me to not be in a group so it could pick me off. There was no way, in frozen hell, I would let it anywhere near my friends. The older brother had left to go to a friend's house later that night as well, and the friend we were all staying with lived with her grandma. There was no strong men around. I lived around the neighborhood and both my mom and dad were home. My dad is a big guy, standing at 6'2", and strong as hell, but it would be too far to run. I could not go out there to see what it was even if I wanted to. Even though I am fast, I was weak considering how late it was, and I would become this thing's prey easily. Knowing this, I just laid back, knife at the ready, listening in absolute horror. You do not know what true vulnerability is until you are on the outskirts of the woods in a tent with 3 lives in your hands, while some paranormal creature is hunting you, teasing you, and you only have one close combat weapon that you are not even certain will put a scratch on it. I sat there in silence until around 6 in the morning, when I was certain that it had stopped. I could not take it anymore. The thing had driven me absolutely insane. My work there was done, and I was certain it was gone. I left the knife on my pillow, and a note that said I went home. I was not dead, so I could reassure my friends when they woke up later. I began to walk to my house, and to my house the streets were poorly illuminated by street lamps. There were not that many, leaving a ton of dark spaces that I could not see even if I tried. To make matters 10 times worse, my glasses were smudged, and I could barely see a thing out of them. I knew it was better to my advantage if I kept them on though, because I am blind as a bat. I scanned my surroundings my whole way there, keeping my eyes on every direction this thing could attack from. The thing was probably just waiting to get me alone, but I was not going to let it do anything to me. When I finally got to my house, the door was unlocked to my relief, so I could get in without my parents hearing me. Unfortunately, this was 5 in the morning, and as I mentioned before, clumsy as ever, I bumped into everything as I tried to navigate myself to my room, where I forced myself to go to sleep. After that, when asked, my friends would say it was a screamer firework or some animal, but I can tell they were just too scared to really face the reality. I tried to make sense of it, but I just could not. I knew what I heard, and I knew it was much worse than they could have imagined. They probably thought I mentioned flesh gates and skinwalkers just to scare them, but I honestly believe it was one of the two. Nothing like this has ever happened to me again, but there is a reason we have not been sleeping outside for quite a long time.